Welcome so much to our symposium this afternoon. We're very excited. My name is Jeff Thies, the Director for the Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability. And we're really excited to bring together really a distinguished panel of both industry and city and nonprofit innovation thought leaders, really fundamentally about engaging constructively the question of the world we live in, and really how do we engage the questions of climate impact and sustainability. And so I'll introduce each of the speakers as we present them for their session. And this format of the sessions are really designed to be first sharing some ideas and some content, really followed by an opportunity for Q&A and the opportunity for some dialogue. We will want to continue to kind of move this, the session forward, and at the same time have opportunity for dialogue. From a logistics standpoint, the restrooms are downstairs. So if you need to excuse yourself for that, you'll see a sign right outside the door letting you know where those are downstairs. But as we begin our symposium, it is my great honor to introduce you to our Dean Dale Smith, who will begin the symposium with some words of welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, for those of you who are not students, welcome to LMU, the College of Business Administration, our Hilton building, and the second annual Business as a Force for Good Business Ethics Symposium. We are delighted to have everyone here on the bluff with, if you're outside, views from the ocean and Santa Monica Mountains all the way to the Hollywood Hills. You know, as you look outside and you look on the bluff, one can't help but be reminded of the delicate interaction behind the place we call home and the realities of the environment in which we live. Hence, the theme for our symposium this afternoon couldn't be more timely or relevant. Let's consider for a moment the conditions in which we find ourselves given this reality. It's late October. We've got the Santa Ana winds, the temperature challenges. The highs today, I checked about an hour ago, were 94. 2 days ago, the happiest place on earth in Anaheim reported they were the hottest place in the USA at 97 degrees. Again, it was mid-October. We've had another season of wildfires. Real estate is in danger again, with people losing homes and whole communities being destroyed. Utilities are shutting off power to manage risk, and the whole concept of risk management is changing, as all of these forces are beginning to intersect. These challenges are right in our backyard, and they're taking place in a much broader context, the context of climate change, and the ways in which business, the public sector, industry, and academia must work together to understand both the problems and the opportunities that these realities create. Certainly, within the context of a college of business, we also recognize the role of business education. Our own mission statement, newly placed upon the walls of our Hilton lobby that you may have seen when you walked in as you registered for the conference, the symposium today, affirms our commitment to being part of the solution. That mission says that we advance knowledge and develop business leaders with moral courage and creative confidence to be a force for good in the global community. The Sustainable Development Goals that were outlined by the United Nations calls for all of us to be partners in addressing the very real issues we face, and many of those issues we'll be discussing this afternoon. We'll need that moral courage and that creative confidence, and much of what we need and what we can do starts right here at home. And as our mission calls for it, we'll take that leadership, that moral courage, and that creative confidence. But it'll take more than that. It'll take the kind of collaboration that our keynote speaker will challenge us to seek today, and it'll take a commitment to the kind of partnerships that's characterized by today's symposium topic, inherently interdisciplinary in nature. Our symposium today is co-sponsored by CBA's Institute for Business Ethics and Sustainability, and also LMU's Center for Urban Resilience. Two organizations that bring together leaders from business, government, academics, the nonprofit sector, highlighting the important work that's being done and exploring opportunities for innovation and exploration moving forward with a special focus on real estate sector. an industry that's so incredibly important to Los Angeles, the economy, and beyond. As we get ready for a very impactful afternoon, I'm reminded of the words of one of my favorite leadership gurus, Meg Wheatley. And she wrote, and these are powerful words to me, that there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Think about that for a second. There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. So I was asked to call upon all of you and give you words of welcome. So I welcome you to the community, because we are those change agents. And I hope that we'll look at this afternoon to figure out just what that change is going to be like. So with that, back to you, Jeff, and introducing our keynote speaker.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Jens Molback, who is our keynote speaker this afternoon. You see on the slide that he has presented here, he really wants to share an idea around innovation that really is first and foremost the creation of a mindset around the way in which public, private, governmental sectors both work together and really bring value in the way in which the synergies and the specific gifts that each of those sectors bring can work on critical issues. Jens will speak to the details of what that is in both theoretical, kind of the construct, and then also in very practical and specific ways in which this approach is applied. But we are deeply honored to have Jens here. He is an entrepreneur. He is a thought leader. He is bringing innovation to both cities and to organizations, both here and in the United States. He is working with the United Nations. He is really passionate about bringing this idea that can advance the work that we know is so central to what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And we are also proud that as of about 6 weeks ago, Jens is part of the Lions family. So it's wonderful to have Jens Molback here. Please welcome our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Jeff. So appreciate it. All right, is the mic on and working? Good afternoon, everybody. Just to clarify, I'm not a direct part. My daughter's a freshman here, so I'm super excited about it, and she's very happy about it, too. So I've spent most of my life in the private sector, but 4 years ago I founded Win-Win as a nonprofit. We're based in Seattle. We work primarily throughout the U.S., but increasingly we're being asked to expand globally, which is exciting, and we think that the work we're doing, we hope, can be replicated many, many times over. I want to start by clarifying this is about real estate and climate change. I am neither an expert in real estate nor an expert in climate change. I know a little bit about both, just enough to be dangerous. But my hope today is to share some of the work and some of the examples that we've been working on as models for you to think about when you're actually approaching some of the very real challenges in climate change. When you think about the real estate industry, if you look globally, it's one of the largest asset classes in the world. It's about $260 trillion of global value tied up in real estate. And about 75% of that is in residential value, the homes we live in, the places we stay, and the other 25% is broken up between commercial and agriculture. Small changes in the value of that can ripple throughout the entire global economy. And when you look at the challenges that I could find in thinking about real estate, we don't know what's going to happen. Climate change is scary. It's depressing. It's overwhelming. We don't know what's going to happen or when. And yet we have to deal with it on a daily basis. We have to be able to think about and plan for the sort of things that are happening here. One personal story, I was in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and I was going to fly down to the Bay Area for a conference, and I looked online, and there were these big announcements about 2 to 3 million people being blocked out for power due to the potential of wildflowers. And I thought, should I go to my conference? Are the lights going to be on? You know, I actually called the hotel. They're like, well, we think we're going to have power till midnight. I'm like, well, I have to give a presentation. Can I actually use up my laptop? And I almost didn't go. But I went, but I was thinking about all the direct and the indirect costs that'll flow out through uncertainty with climate change. So this is a big list. I'm sure the other panelists who are experts in real estate will go through some of these things. But when I look at it, what I'm reminded of is the 1975 quote from Jaws. It's scary. right? There's a lot of stuff coming at us, and I'm not sure we have the tools or the mindset or the approaches that are going to be required to really deal with this at the scale for what's coming over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So those issues are what I like to call the whats. They're the verticals, the things we actually have to practically solve. And I'm not going to talk about any of those in my talk. What I'd like to talk with you about is the how. How are we going to actually go about solving these problems? If you remember the definition of insanity, right, keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. If you think about the way we got here, the way our companies run, the way our governments run, and the way our nonprofits run, which are the pillars of our society, if we keep doing it the same way, are we really likely to get different results? So at Win-Win, we focus on how we actually do the work and how organizations function. So this is the equation we solve for. And there's a couple of ways to think about this. One, if you take an impact view first about any of the problems you care about, one thing we think about is we think about, hey, if we want to solve a problem, what are the best assets that companies have? What are the best assets that the social sector has? And what are the best assets that the government has? And can we actually blend and mix and match the best tools from each sector? Because each sector is important and it has unique and distinctive competencies that are really important. So that's one way to think about this. The other way to think about it is this is not the way we build our organizations. We're at a business school, so this is not the business model for most companies. This is not the business model for most government entities, and this is not the business model for most nonprofits. But at Win-Win, we're trying to get organizations to think differently about how they actually construct their core model. And if we can get organizations to change and incorporate this sort of thinking, we think we can generate much bigger change at scale. So I'm going to start with what I call the Trisector Day, just to kind of get us all grounded when I talk about Trisector and Trisector innovation. So I woke up this morning in a hotel here in LA. It had been built by a private sector for-profit developer. I took a shower, and the water came out from the water district. It was a nice, clean shower, so I was very happy to have fresh, clean water from the government. And I had a cup of coffee that had been certified fair trade by a nonprofit organization. I hadn't even left my hotel room, and I was already having a Trisector Day. And you guys can think about how you interact with the sectors. You drive on public sector roads. You use the internet, which was invented by government, by the way. You might be working with a sports club, which is a nonprofit organization. And all day long, whether you realize it or not, all three sectors are around you all the time. It seems kind of obvious, but we don't always think about it this way. So let's talk about the problems. Big problems in the world, little problems in the world. They have some things that are common, right? Problems are tough. They're complicated. They're multi-sectorial. We can think about any of the climate change problems we're thinking about. And importantly, they're expensive. We think that everybody has something to offer. We think companies are important, governments are important, and nonprofits are important. But when you look systemically at how we organize our society and our economy, this isn't the way we go about optimizing the resources. The expensive piece comes up a lot. So let me put the expensive piece in context. We're in California, and the frequent quote is you have the 5th largest economy in the world, right? So $2.7 trillion annual GDP. That's a big number every year. But I think it's even bigger, because I like to look at the balance sheet. What are all the resources that exist in California? So if you think about the total balance sheet, if you add up everything in the world, I mentioned all the value of real estate, the world has about 500 trillion of assets in it. And if you scope that down, there's about $15 trillion worth of actual assets that the companies, the nonprofits, and the governments have in the state of California. That's a lot of stuff. The question is, how do we use those assets, the current assets? So at Win-Win, we have this framework, and everything we do to solve that equation hangs upon this framework. The first thing we think about in terms of solving problems is, can we repurpose existing resources? What are the best resources in governments, nonprofits, and companies? And how can we pick and choose those resources? Can we realign them in interesting ways to drive more compelling results? We also focus a lot on self-interest. We think self-interest is a very important part of the model. We want to know, what is the self-interest of the government agency that might be doing the work? What are they really trying to do for citizens? What's the self-interest of the nonprofit organization? What are they really trying to do? And what's the self-interest of the company? And by the self-interest of the company, I don't mean the donations or the CSR, but I mean their core business. What do they really do? And if we can harness the best self-interest of all three of those sectors and then align them, then we have models that can scale and sustain over time. But it's also got to be done for common benefit. When these models work and we can solve for that equation, great things happen. We find that governments are more efficient, nonprofits more scalable, and companies more profitable, and we get greater impact. Okay, so that's the setup. I'm going to give you a couple examples that are, again, not real estate oriented, not climate oriented, but we're going to extrapolate from those in a little bit. So the first example I want to share is a company I founded called Coinstar. I'm just curious, how many people in the room have ever used a machine or seen a machine? Okay, good to know. I used to ask this question in 1990 and no hands went up. So it's always fun now when most people have at least seen them or use them. A lot of people know what Coinstar is, coin counting machines in supermarkets, but few people know why I started the company, which is what's really relevant to here. I was really interested in all three sectors, and I wanted my work to reflect that in the actual model that I did. So with Coinstar, when I was a grad student actually in business school, I got intrigued by the jar of pennies on my dresser top. And there was a fair bit of money in there. And I thought other people had jars too. So I ended up writing to the Fed and the Mint. And what I learned was they had actually manufactured $15 billion worth of physical coin stock to supply the US economy. So that was a lot of money, right? I did some market research with the encouragement of a business school professor. I hung outside of Bay Area supermarkets. Hi, a grad student, do you have coins at home? And what became clear to me that there was about $7 billion sitting on America's dresser tops, right? And so that was a lot of money sitting out there. But it also meant that $8 billion was actually in circulation, supplying our economy every day. And I'd taken a macroeconomics class, so I realized that $8 billion turned over 20 times a year and created a $150 billion market. Well, to a 26-year-old entrepreneur, a $150 billion market was a pretty big market to think about. So I thought, oh, this could be interesting. Could start a company here. But I also thought about the nonprofit sector. I thought about the history of coins and charity, Salvation Army, with the red buckets at the holidays, March of Dimes, or think about UNICEF. Anybody ever do the UNICEF program with the orange boxes at Halloween, right? So I thought, oh, we could wire these machines up to accept donations. And then I realized if we got enough of these coins back into circulation, we could actually become the national coin recycling system for the government and have a huge impact on government costs to reduce them. So that's what happened. Okay, I'll skip a lot of the story, but Coinstar worked. It was a successful company that was out there. What I want to focus on are these bottom two bullet points. UNICEF actually called us up in the mid-90s, and they said, hey, we have this orange box program at Halloween, which is now coming up, and we have two problems. Half the kids never send us the money, and the other half the kids actually send us hundreds of thousands of orange boxes, and we have to open them up and count them. So we said, we're actually mission built for you. Just tell the kids to bring the boxes down to the Coinstar machine. They put a little message on the back of the box. They typed in a 4-digit code. We cut our fee in half from 8% to 4%, and we wire transfer through the funds to UNICEF, and we printed out a tax receipt. So it's this great marriage of technology and usefulness for UNICEF. Big win for them. Also a good win for us as a company, because we had people using our machines. A year later, I got a call from the Fed. We'd actually rolled out about 100 Ralph's and Vons stores here in LA. It's our biggest rollout ever. And the Fed called me, which was slightly intimidating to get a call from the Fed. And the call went, who are you and what are you doing? The West Coast has canceled all future penny orders. That's, by the way, an old phone for those of you who are used to the cell phones. That's what they used to look like. But the Fed was really interested. So we went back and met with them, and they became utterly fascinated with what we were doing with this whole recycling program. But they were also confused. Like, you're not a bank, we can't regulate you. You're not a supplier, you're not a customer. Like, what do we do with you? And we're like, you don't have to do anything. You already created the market. You actually made the market for this to happen, right? So we've already had our win. Now you're getting your win. So the Fed really loved that. What was also helpful to us with working in the public sector was a couple years later, I got a call from the head of the Royal Mint in the UK who said, hey, I've been talking to the Fed. You're saving the US government all this money. Would you please come do the same thing for us in the UK? So went over, met him, and we rolled out 1,000 machines in the UK inside of 6 months. And the only reason we could do it so quickly was we had the introductions from the public sector. If we were a strictly private sector focused company without the public benefit, we would never have been able to generate that sort of returns from our private sector shareholders. So that's where I learned the equation, right? You can actually have a business model where each sector both contributes to and benefits from. So that's example one. I'll give you example 2. Here's the conceptual piece. There's actually resources. Think about this in this way. There's resources in all 3 sectors. If you can pick and choose the right resources to make one of these models work, and you can actually unlock them by aligning the self-interest, you can create a win-win model. So that's conceptually what we're doing. It's a little more sophisticated version of the equation. Now I'll give you the second example. Has anybody heard of a company called Propel based in New York, or an app called Fresh EBT? 0. Okay, in 3 years, I think all the hands will go up. This is one of my favorite companies, and I love the work they do, and they use a Trisector model. So these guys wanted to do tech for good, and they were focused on the food stamp system. So in the US, about 1 in 7 Americans is on something called the SNAP program. And I think it's fairly stunning that in the wealthiest country in the world, we have 1 out of 7 people who is food insecure. And the way the system works is the Department of Agriculture hands $70 billion to the states. The states then turn around and hire a credit card company that manufactures a debit card in effect, and about $200 a month goes on to this debit card, which creates the food stamp system in the US, and that's the way it works. And these guys got really interested in it, and what they discovered after doing some market research was that if you're the user, if you're, we call her Maria, and you're on food stamps, that $200 only lasts you about 2 weeks. So after your first week, you're feeling pretty good about it, but your second week, you're getting nervous about what your balance is. Because it turns out your balance isn't on the card, your balance gets printed at the bottom of the receipt when you're done shopping. And if you think about that, that's actually a terrible time to know your balance, right, when you're done shopping. So what Maria really does is she comes in and buys a single item, a Coke, or a candy bar or something, gets her balance, then she goes shopping to make sure she won't run out of money and be embarrassed at the checkout stand. So these guys said, we can help that. We're going to create an app, and we're going to give her balance, which is when I met them. And what was really interesting was they had all the seeds of a really terrific Trisector strategy. Because it turns out when they got their balance, they actually also got all the transaction data, which means they have access to up to $70 billion of market share data in the US supermarket industry, which is kind of an extraordinary piece. So they changed their business model, and they actually can now deliver incremental value to Maria based upon the data. So when Maria goes shopping, she can get additional discounts from the supermarket, from the manufacturers, other people, and she could recognize $40, $50, $60 a month, every month on top of this. So it's a wonderful model. We also incorporated other public sector benefits, because the win-win model says, are there other public sector government benefits that could be useful? So they created a map that sort of geolocates where she is, and it locates government programs like the farmers markets, because government here in LA, and actually all throughout the US, will double the value of food stamp benefits if Maria shops at a farmer's market and buys fresh vegetables. It's a broadly distributed federal program, but it's dramatically underutilized. So it's an existing government resource that Propel could repurpose and put on the app for Maria to drive usage. They did the same thing for the summer meals program. If Maria has kids, those kids are actually fed breakfast and lunch during the school year in school, but in summer, government actually does that. So they download the database for every location where she could go get her kids fed breakfast and lunch every day. So really useful for her. We also added in social sector benefits. So if you think about Maria's life in that Trisector day, there are hundreds of social sector organizations that have assets that are useful to her. Job training, childcare, diapers, parental help. And we can actually act as a concierge service for Maria. So when you step back and think about what Propel has done, they've actually given Maria access to the resource she needs to live a Trisector day. She doesn't live her life in the sectors, right? So this is a super helpful app. And from a business model standpoint, try to compete against Propel if you're not using a Trisector model. This is actually a better way to do it. And punchline is they attracted capital from the Omidyar network and Andreessen Horowitz, and then Kleiner Perkins. They are tapping top flight investor capital for something that I think will be one of the most transformative changes to a social safety net program in the US government. They're serving over 2.5 million people per month right now after 2 years, and we think they'll scale to 10 million people. It's really a cool story. So what's common here between Coinstar and Propel, if you think about it, Coinstar was a $150 billion market that existed in the public sector. Private sector came along and did some interesting stuff. The same thing happened here, right? $70 billion market, unique users, databases, and something got put together. So what we got really interested in is we said, well, wait a second, there are thousands of programs. Step back and look at the economy. Think about all the programs in government, city, county, district, state, federal. Think about all the nonprofits. Think about all the companies. What would it look like if you could start to align specific resources across the sectors to drive impact and build these sort of stronger models? So this is what we've been doing the last 4 years. And we've learned to ask questions and build tools to get people thinking this way. So you guys can play along with me. Let's just say you are all private sector for the time being. I know there's government in the room and nonprofit in the room, but let's just be companies for a moment. If you were a company, I'd ask you a simple question. What's your private sector strategy? You'd have a good answer. Then I'd ask you, what's your social sector strategy? How do you work with nonprofits in a way that's good for your own core business, for your own profit and growth, that is also mission aligned with what that 501c3 is trying to do? Most companies understand the question, some are actually doing it. The one that trips the companies up is this last one. How do you work with government? And I'll often get answers like, we don't want to work with government, they're going to slow us down, they're going to tax us, they're going to regulate us. Now, I don't know, think about this differently. Government's done a lot of things that are really useful and really valuable. What assets has government built that could be good for your business, and what things could you do in your core business that could be good for government? And I'd say most companies still struggle with the question. So I have to say things like, hey, I found a $150 billion market in my pocket full of pennies. Propel found a $70 billion market in an old federal social safety net program. Do I at least have your attention? Are you willing to entertain there might be something useful in government? And what we've also learned is other organizations can ask these same questions. If you're a nonprofit, you can ask, what's your private sector strategy and what's your public sector strategy? And if you're a government entity, you can say, what's my private sector strategy that's not about taxation and regulation? And these questions open us up to some really interesting ways to go forward. So win-win, we talk about a different mindset, and we talk about this Trisector innovation all the time. And importantly, we're building tools to actually get there. We're building a platform to both inspire and enable this form of thinking. There's 4 parts to what we do. We're building a toolkit with data so we can actually show people where these assets are and help them put it together. We're creating lots of examples and use cases and stories. We're working with universities, incubators, accelerators to drive this sort of innovation, to actually teach and train new entrepreneurs and existing business development people. And then we're socializing this idea with investors. Not only early stage venture investors, large private equity investors, large companies making these investments internally. We're also working with funders and other investors in general. So what we find is these Trisector models often look weird in the beginning, and we're trying to say, hey, pay attention to these things so they're actually quite strong. You're actually embedding impact into a model that can scale. So these things are really powerful. We've been rolling this out in different regions in the US by working with different universities. We're working with a lot of different players. When we come into a region, we work with the universities, foundations, NGO networks, companies across everybody. And we're creating public good, publicly accessible tools so that anybody can start to do this innovation and start to learn around this. We've been working with little companies. We're currently working with Fortune 100s, Fortune 1000s. We're working with city governments, county governments, community foundations, and as I mentioned, we're starting to expand overseas. One of the things we do is we create a set of data and a workbench. This thing here we call the innovation dashboard, which actually pulls all this information together. And we use questions to get people to think about this. And we'll start to get to the climate change stuff here in a second. We ask questions like, who's on your team and what are their resources? If you can think broadly about all the resources out there, what can you pick and choose to assemble your own win-win model? We think about what the community wants and what people are saying. What do people need? What are their opportunities? And importantly, we think about ways to focus. We use a tool called impact journeys, which help us solve specific problems quite quickly, and I'll show you some of those. So just to give you a sense of a few of these things on the wiki, what we've done is we use different frameworks. We actually use the global goals. We use other frameworks like the Social Progress Index, and we're just now starting to think about expanding to climate frameworks like the Yale EPI and also Project Drawdown. And what we do is we organize resources by impact. So for instance, and we'll see if this works, I can show you that if you were interested in being on the team for hunger or global health, if I click through, going through the hunger team, you will see a database that comes up All this will be online and available to all of us. We can all contribute to it and benefit from it. And it'll start to show you what different people do in the different areas. And I'll just show you one example here. So this is what we have in the States. And if I wanted to look at my hometown and I'm curious about hunger, let's say I'm Jimmy and I'm putting together the program for Propel, I could click on the state of Washington. I could say, hey, I'm actually working on, let's see if this comes up. I'm working on ending hunger, which is a goal we call SDG 2.1. And what this will tell me is that in the state of Washington, there are 159 social sector organizations, 53 public sector entities, and 43 private companies that have programs around hunger and resources, including 25 at the state, 14 at the city, 9 at the county, and other ones. And there's a list of every company. Every company's broken out so we can see this, and every sector. And I'll just do this once here. So you can look at, let's say, if you wanted to look in government, you could say, what does the city of Seattle have around hunger? And you can look through and see that Seattle has 8 different organizations that focus around hunger. I don't know if that's too small to see. But what I want to show you here is they have a program here called Fresh Bucks in the Office of Sustainability, which doubles the value of food stamp benefits. They have another program called the Summer Meals Program, right? So this was a way for an innovator to find resources that exist in government they didn't have to build themselves, so they could actually just repurpose and add in there. So that gives you a sense of what's in this tool. Let's see if I can get that to come out here. And it can do a number of other things too. So we've been working closely in the Bay Area with Silicon Valley Community Foundation. I won't take you through this right now, but if you click through on this, we'd actually go look through at San Mateo County and Santa Clara County. And we've mapped out 20,000 organizations across city government, county government, and we can look at every organization by impact, every company and all the nonprofits, so we can see what are the ingredients, what are the tools. Each organization has their own wiki page. This is an example of General Motors. And one of the things, I won't go click through this again, but if you go through it, you'll see that GM is actually tagged to all of the SDGs as sort of a data taxonomy. And you'd expect GM to be on some teams that make sense. They're on the team for transportation. They're on the team for electrification of the fleet. What's unexpected when you look at a company like General Motors is they're also on the team for disaster response, and they're also on the team for mental health. So what's a car company doing on the team for disaster response? Anybody here drive a General Motors car by any chance? One? Okay. So in a General Motors car, there's a little button called OnStar, and you can call and make reservations, get information. Turns out all the cars are 4G enabled. And what we learned when we were at General Motors is during natural disasters, when the cell towers go down, FEMA and first responders and for the Red Cross will actually run to General Motors cars, because when the cell network goes down, they use their entire car as an antenna and they create a roving mesh communications network. So isn't it kind of interesting that the government has a private sector company's resource as a backbone that they didn't have to build, right? They also do things like handle suicide calls. Why would General Motors get a suicide call? Well, if you're a returning veteran, it turns out you like a Chevy pickup. And if you get into trouble with PTSD or other things, you may not call the crisis hotline or 911. You'll actually sit in your car and call General Motors. So General Motors is on the front line. It's just something they do. But if you talk to the mental health community, they're like, oh my God, 17% of the cars on the road have a mental health hotline. What can we do to help General Motors? How can we repurpose and do something even more powerful? So that's a tool. We can map out cities, we can map out nonprofits, we've mapped out the Veterans Administration. The idea is to get all of us, to get all of society's resources organized, public, and available, organized by impact. I'm going to show you one other tool here that we call impact journeys. And this is just really designed about where to focus, right? Knowing who has what and what resources will not get you to a place of innovation. You have to go through some other steps here too. This is the project we did in Seattle around homelessness, which I know is a big topic here in LA. And what the team did there is we actually went through and we mapped out all the resources for homelessness. I'm not going to show you now, but if you click through this, you would see that in Seattle there are 432 nonprofit organizations, 237 and 105 companies who have assets and resources around homelessness. It's much, much bigger than anybody realizes. And the question is, how can you actually start to realign and get those resources hooked up to have a bigger impact on homelessness? So it's been a very powerful database. The other thing I want to show you here is something we call the impact journeys. And this is the tool we've been developing over the last year, which we have found to be very powerful. Because again, the resources are enough, you really want to know where to go to focus on the problem. So we started thinking about the homeless problem, and we realized that we had to focus somewhere. So we chose to focus on people who are not yet homeless, people who are, like to say, homeless on the brink, and the other half, the people who actually live in their cars. And we did a deep data mapping about what happens. And I won't take you through the actual piece, but basically you start out stable here and you go through a whole bunch of different steps, and you're interacting with the different sectors. Sometimes you're working with a bank, sometimes you're working with a pawn shop, and we put a Trisector lens about who operates where. And what we found is there were some really important choke points. So for instance, in Seattle, if you're late on a rent payment by 3 weeks, you can get a pay or vacate notice on your door that says you got 3 days to either stay or go. So the city is actually creating homelessness by creating eviction. So we started thinking, are there Trisector solutions for eviction insurance that could be put in place by government and the private sector and social sector that could help tide someone over for 2 or 3 months? We also focused a lot on vehicle homelessness because half the people end up in cars. Turns out cars are safe, right? They can be secured, they're sheltered from the elements, and they also have all your worldly possessions. And what we learned was that if you have an expired license tab, which you're likely to have, your car cannot be towed as long as you're in it. So people in Seattle are wondering why all the homeless people hang out by the cars. It's because they can't afford to leave. They can't afford to go get a shower or apply for a job, right? So we're starting to map out policy here too, which is part of this innovation process. And we've done it for homelessness. We're starting to apply to other areas. Lead poisoning, student debt reduction might be relevant here. Food insecurity, teen mental health. And our vision here is that universities and community foundations and government entities can start to build out these shared impact journeys on a collaborative basis, like on a Wikipedia basis, linked into the resource set, tied into an innovation engine, so we can actually start to find ways to move these things forward using existing resources. All those tools integrate into something we call an innovation dashboard. And I just showed you one that's kind of filled out for Propel here. It basically uses all the tools I just talked about. The wiki, key team members across the sectors, their key resources, self-interests, key experts spotlighting different pieces. And I can go into more depth if you guys are interested in this. We work in different ways. As I mentioned up front, we function primarily as a 501c3. We think all these tools, all this information should be available to all of us. We also do some specific work with different entities. We're about to start working in the UK on teen mental health when we find some interesting opportunities to focus on. And increasingly, investors are following us around because they're saying, you find really interesting models at early stages, and we're interested because your companies tend to do well. At Rutgers and Newark, we've been working. They've actually been hosting competitions and using win-win as a methodology for teams to have competitions to drive innovation, something that could be done here at LMU. We've hosted business plan competitions where we give out prizes for the best use of Trisector methodologies. This is an app in Seattle that's actually focused on homeless giving, and they've done terrific work. This was a case study that was sponsored by T-Mobile that was trying to solve the homework gap because 40% of kids don't have access to high-speed internet. And where Jeff and I met, we did some work in Cleveland with the Prime Network, which is 750 universities globally who are thinking about the global goals. What I want to close with is thinking about this for climate change, right? So how could we start to think about this methodology and these tools and this approach for climate change? One is we would love to stand up the wiki here in LA, have it be open source, open data as a public good. We'd like to add a climate lens, because we think that to actually solve the climate problems, they're so specific, we need ways to organize the information in different ways and create these collaborative impact journeys. So for instance, how many of you have heard of Project Drawdown? Okay. So Drawdown's done a great job about organizing all the things can be changed, right, or that we could be focusing on in a stacked ranked order. And some people like the framework, some people don't like the framework. But let me just use it as an illustration. So for instance, one of the biggest things we can do is to get wind turbines offshore, right? 84 gigatons come out. Reducing plant waste, educating women and girls, district heating, electric vehicles, which aren't that big, by the way, in the whole scheme of things. But just like we've done with the global goals and other frameworks, what would it be like if you could click through this and say, who's on the team for reducing food waste here in LA? What are all the resources across the sectors for each one of those things? And can we start to organize our best resources from all three sectors so we could actually start to apply these methodologies to making change on climate change and finding solutions? We also think it'd be really interesting to start to develop some of these impact journeys with the Trisector lens linked into the resources. We talked about wildfires. Who's on the team for wildfires? What does that journey look like? Who are the companies? Who are the nonprofits? Who are the government agencies? What are their best resources? How can they be lined up and when? Where are the choke points? Where could we start to drive innovation? And as we start to build these solutions out, they can be built on collaboratively. So when we come back to that slide I put up first, what I'm interested and want to challenge you to think about is all of these what problems, right? I've been talking about the how. Can you start to apply the headset and the tools so you can start to specifically and pragmatically in a focused way start to get after these things? Because the things we believe are the following. To solve the problems that we care about, we need the best knowledge and resources from each sector. We need what I call the full team. We cannot afford to leave anybody off the team. There's no way that we don't need government, there's no way that we don't need companies, and there's no way that we don't need nonprofits. Because we need the best ideas and resources from all the sectors to drive innovation. That's what's going to deliver solutions for us at scale. So what I'd like to encourage all of you to do is to become a Trisector innovator. To think this way, whatever your organization is, whatever the problems you're focused on, I encourage you to adopt this set of lenses and this way of thinking about problems. Because if we all do, then I think we have a chance of saving the planet and making this a habitable place to be for the long haul. So, thank you. Sure.
Is there any questions? About 5 minutes for questions?
How long did it take you to accumulate all that data from all those different public agencies and private agencies?
So we're doing it in two phases. The question is, how do we get all the data in for the wiki and the other things? We've been working with universities and with grad students. So we have a team of 3 grad students in the summer who will come through and they'd say, you know, and so in the Bay Area, we had funding from Silicon Valley Community Foundation. We had a team from Stanford come through and think about all that's out there. And it was about a 2 to 3 months process. But ultimately, the vision here is to turn this over like Wikipedia and make it a public good, so that anybody can update any organization. So this becomes a dynamic, fluid piece, and then we organize all the information by impact.
Any other? Well, Jens, thank you so very much.
Sure.
Thank you. We're going to do a little technology transfer. Jens, thank you so very much for your presentation. We really wanted to start with this presentation because really around the mindset that you shared, a way of thinking to drive innovation, but also to recognize that this is a shared initiative. We're going to be looking at individual dimensions of this, especially as we look at public policy plans, specific industry applications of these things, but really thinking about that through this broader lens that you shared is really the gift that you give us in starting this way. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.